I got beef with even numbers, so instead of giving you a top 10, I'm going to give you my top 9 biggest culture shocks for Americans moving to Mexico. I've been living here in Mexico for just under 6 months, so my perspective is still fresh enough that I can give you an idea of the things that are going to be pretty different for you if you're moving to Mexico from the United States. So without further ado, let's get into the first culture shock, and that is driving. Driving in Mexico is crazy. The first thing you'll notice when driving in Mexico is that the drivers are just very aggressive. Much more aggressive than what I saw in the United States. Like, you can guarantee without a doubt, if someone has an option between accelerating and braking, they're gonna accelerate. And if people think you're going too slow, they're just gonna pass you. And there's like a whole language and code that Mexican drivers use to communicate with each other, which, like, if you're a foreigner like me, then you wouldn't know unless you have somebody there to tell you. So that's why I'm gonna tell you guys what this secret code is. So in Mexico, they communicate a lot with like their headlights and blinkers, but not in the way that we do in the United States. For example, if there's a traffic jam or if you have to brake suddenly, then you'll see everyone in front of you start putting on their hazard lights. And this is just to like give a warning to the cars behind that you're gonna have to slam on the brakes soon. There's like a car accident or there's a lot of heavy traffic, which is honestly pretty nice and considerate. I mean, we do something similar in Ohio where if you pass a cop, people will usually flash their headlights just to give a warning to the oncoming traffic that, hey, there's a cop, slow down, put away the crack pipe, like whatever you have to do. But there's a lot of other ways that people in Mexico use their blinkers. For example, if you're in the left lane and somebody wants to pass you, they will turn on their left blinker to tell you to get out of the lane or get out of their way. And if that's not enough, then they'll start flashing their headlights at you. And pretty much everybody is speeding like 30 to 40 kilometers over the speed limit. It kind of feels like the traffic laws here are suggestions rather than laws. A lot of people just don't stop at stop signs, I've noticed. You really have to be extra aware when you're driving in Mexico of the drivers around you and what they're doing. But because nobody follows the traffic laws and there's a lot of speeding going on, there's so many topes on Mexican roads, which are like these speed bumps that are just, they come out of nowhere. Sometimes you don't see those topes until the last moment, so a lot of wear and tear on your vehicle. But yeah, so be warned, I can make a whole video just about driving in Mexico and all the intricacies of it. Let's get on to the next culture shock, which is the food in Mexico. Our idea of Mexican food in the United States is, for the most part, wrong. A lot of foods that we eat that are Mexican foods, when you come to Mexico, they'll be a lot different. For example, tacos are almost always served in soft shell corn tortillas. And in the United States, like, we get those Ortega or McCormick pre-made taco dinner kits. Real Mexican tacos are nothing like that, which is a good thing. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like, taco kits are delicious, but real Mexican tacos, you can just tell they are made with a lot better quality ingredients. So American Mexican food is not Mexican food. Things like Taco Bell and Chipotle, if you come to Mexico, they won't even know what you're talking about, because like Chipotle is a pepper. So if you talk about going and wanting to eat Chipotle, they'll be like, what? Because they don't have the restaurant Chipotle here in Mexico, and they don't have Taco Bell in Mexico either. For example, the gorditas that they sell in Taco Bell in the United States, if you come to Mexico and eat like a real authentic gordita, they're completely different. And really, like, the typical things we eat at Mexican restaurants in the United States, like fajitas, burritos, tacos, like, that's just scratching the surface of how many ways you can put together tortillas and meat in Mexico. There's so many foods with those two ingredients: sopes, tacos, burritos, nachos, chilaquiles, quesadillas. So many foods that are just variations of putting together cheese, meat, and tortilla. Almost everything has chili and lime in Mexico. Like, even the candy comes with tajin and a little bit of lime. It's just in every food, so you get used to it when you're living in Mexico. Learn to expect it. A lot of chili and lime, even in the beer, like, everything is chili and lime. So the next biggest culture shock is the landscape in Mexico. Mexico is really varied and has jungles, deserts, mountainous regions, of course the beaches in Cancun, Playa del Carmen, Puerto Vallarta, and Acapulco. But really, like, Mexico is so geographically diverse. Like, for example, I didn't know this, but the Copper Canyon in Mexico is like a second Grand Canyon in central Mexico, which I'd never heard of before I moved here. Another example like that is that the largest tropical rainforest north of the Amazon is located in the Yucatan, the Mayan forest, and Mexico also is home to the largest underground cave system in the world, which is cool, I guess. If you're a speleologist, you can go spelunking. So all these beautiful places to visit within Mexico really makes it really sad that the next culture shock is the crime in Mexico. I have been scammed. My girlfriend has been scammed. It's crazy because like I'll be talking to Sophie and she'll just casually bring up tragedies. We'll be walking down the street and she'll be like, oh yeah, this is where somebody got shot. And I'm like, oh, awesome, cool story. I have the privilege of having grown up in a very safe neighborhood. Things like locking the door, I can forget that, but like Sophie makes sure every door is locked, the car is locked, everything is secure because she grew up in a very different environment than I did. There's a lot of places to me that seem perfectly safe that my girlfriend completely avoids, and one of those is driving highways at night. In the United States, we have this great highway system where we can take these great American road trips and travel all throughout the countryside. It would be awesome to do the same thing in Mexico, but there's just a lot of crime activity on the highways, especially at night. And if you talk to basically any Mexican, they'll tell you to avoid highways at night. Even normal everyday things like pumping gas can be super stressful because in Mexican gas stations there's usually an attendant who pumps your gas. I've never really seen a gas station where you pump your own gas. And I guess a lot of these attendants are notorious for scamming people in various ways. Every time we pump the gas, there's like a checklist of things like make sure they don't take your card anywhere you can't see it, make sure the pump is in zeros before they start pumping, check the receipt, make sure that they didn't overcharge you. So that was a pretty big culture shock. The next biggest culture shock has to do with servants. So growing up in a middle-class family from the suburbs in Northeast Ohio, having a maid or a live-in servant is a completely foreign concept to me. But I guess it's something that in the upper middle class and wealthy classes in Mexico is super common. Having a maid, somebody who comes and cleans the house, or even having like a live-in house mother or a person who cleans and cooks is pretty common. And it's so common, in fact, in Mexico City in a lot of the apartments. They have built-in servants' quarters on the roof. They'll have specific rooms for the help to live in. And it's even common for families to like take the help on vacation to help clean up and cook meals while the family's on vacation. So that was something I definitely didn't expect, but it's pretty common in Mexico. The next biggest culture shock has to do with the utilities in Mexico, and specifically things like plumbing. So I think it's well known at this point that you shouldn't drink the tap water in Mexico. You usually just buy a botellón, a big bottle of fresh drinking water that people drink from, and then they use the water from the tap for like cleaning and cooking and other things like that. You should also know that in some parts of Mexico, like southern Mexico, the plumbing can't handle toilet paper in some areas. So that's something I experienced when I was living in Ecuador. So what you have to do is put the paper in a bin on the side of the toilet instead of putting it in the toilet. That being said, there's also not as many public restrooms. Usually you have to pay to use like even a gas station bathroom. The next culture shock for Americans or foreigners moving to Mexico would probably have to be the cost of living. Rent and utilities are cheap. They can be very cheap unless you're living in very expensive areas like Roma Norte, La Condesa, and Mexico City. Obviously those are going to be expensive, but on the flip side, some things are a lot more expensive than you might think in Mexico. Specifically, like groceries are expensive, gas is as expensive as it would be in the United States, flights are as expensive as they would be in the United States. It was kind of a shock for me. I expected everything to be super cheap here, but that's not the case. I think it's been getting more expensive because the peso is doing really well right now and inflation is making everything more expensive. That being said, there are a lot of things that are much cheaper in Mexico, and one of those is health insurance. So in the US, I feel like people avoid the doctor at all costs just because it is so expensive. And in Mexico, if you have a headache, sure, go to the doctor, make sure you're all right. If you have a cold, just check in, make sure it's nothing more serious. It's a lot more casual, I guess, in Mexico, or it's like expected that if you don't feel well, you go to the doctor. Whereas in the United States, it's like, how bad do you really feel? Is it that necessary? Unless you're dying, don't go to the hospital. But here in Mexico, people will go even for small things because there is like a public healthcare that is very accessible to the majority of people. And then people who are a little bit more well off usually go to a private doctor just to receive better care and quicker care. I will just say I had an episode recently where I was training for my marathon that I just recently ran, and I overtrained one night and felt really sick. And Sophie was like, oh, we have to go to the doctor. I'm gonna take you to the emergency room. And of course I was adamant against that. I thought like, no, it's gonna be way too expensive. Like I feel fine, I just ran too far.
I'm not gonna see doctor.
She took me to the doctor. It was only around like $75 for the urgent care visit. $75 is not dos pesos, but it's much more inexpensive than it would have been in the United States, especially without insurance. So that just goes to show, like, my American brain just thinks avoid the hospital unless it's completely necessary, whereas in Mexico, it's like, if you feel unwell, go to the hospital. So the last culture shock I faced here in Mexico as an American is the values. Family is the most important thing in Mexico. It really is above all else. The family is constantly in contact and there's a lot of family get-togethers. There's also a lot more traditional values, I would say, in Mexico than in the United States. I've seen this a lot dating Sophie. For example, like us living together is controversial in Mexico, whereas in the United States, I feel like it's totally normal for a couple after 1 year, 2 years, even less than that, to move in together. But here it's like, it's not common. It's still not as widely accepted in Mexico as it would be in the United States. There's still a heavy Catholic influence in Mexico, which you can see with all the churches and cathedrals. So coming from the US, where I feel like traditional family values like that are not as prominent as they might have been in the past, that was a pretty big culture shock. So hopefully this video prepared you for the culture shocks you might experience when you move to Mexico. If I left anything out, please let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm on the journey to 5,000 subscribers. So if you could subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Like the video, share it with a friend, anything to let the algorithm know that you're digging this content. And until the next one, give travel. Bye guys.